Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming out to join us for the relaunch of our series, Christ in Conversation. And hello to those of you who are watching at home as well, as we're being live streamed this evening. Christ in Conversation is a training series for Christians to help us navigate some of those difficult conversations, explaining aspects of our faith that in particular today are under question, under scrutiny. We are very pleased tonight to have with us visiting speaker, the Reverend Dr. Zach Cole. I'll just introduce Zach and then I'll give out the format of the evening. So Zach is originally from Canada. He moved to Florida to study for his bachelor's degree at Palm Beach Atlantic University, moving then to Dallas Theological Seminary, where he studied for his master's in theology. His interest in the transmission and the reliability of gospel manuscripts then led him to pursue a PhD in that area at the University of Edinburgh. And since 2016, he's been living in Northern Ireland with his wife and 3 children. His role at the moment is at Union Theological College, where he's a lecturer in biblical studies, and he continues to have an interest in helping both Christians and those who are weighing up the Christian faith understand better the reliability and the historicity of the gospel manuscripts and other early Christian writings. So thank you very much, Zach, for coming to join us this evening. This is going to be an evening of 2 halves. Zach will speak to us for 25 minutes, and then there will be a 5-minute break. During this time, because of the pandemic restrictions, unfortunately, we'll have to stay in our seats, but it will give you an opportunity to think about questions that you can then put to us either through the mobile number on the screen, or if you prefer to write us as an email to the email address christinconversation@gmail.com. Then Zach will speak to us for another 25 minutes, and there'll be another short break before we have a Q&A session. So please have your questions, be mulling over them during the talk, and we'll look forward to the Q&A afterwards. So I'll pray to begin, and then I'll hand over to Zach. Dear Father, we thank you that throughout history you have called people to yourself. You have spoken into our world, and you have left evidence that we can rely on, that you are real, that you are good, that you're wise, and you're interested in our lives. And you have set about to bring us back to yourself through the coming of the Lord Jesus. And we pray for Zach now as he comes to speak to us, that you would help him to speak to us with clarity of thought, and make our hearts and our minds ready also to receive what he's saying. And I pray that you would equip your people today to be more confident and persuasive as we reach the world that needs to hear the message of Jesus. Amen. Zach.
All right. Thanks so much, Tim. You made me sound really important with that introduction. I hope I don't let you down. Thanks so much for having me tonight. I know I just made you really envious, just taking off my mask. I'm really sorry about that, but we're going to do our best. I'll talk as fast as I can. I'll keep it to 25 minutes as best I can, but I get paid to talk. So keep in mind that, I love to talk about this stuff. So I'll try and keep it to 25. Someone just raise a hand if I'm going way over, and I'll stop, and then we can take our break. I'm going to talk about 2 different topics tonight. We're going to talk about the reliability of the transmission of the New Testament text. Has it got lost in transmission? Has it got garbled or corrupted through time? And how do we know if it has or hasn't? Then in the second half, we're going to talk about the reliability of the history that is recorded in the New Testament. How do we know that we don't just have a fairy tale that's been copied really well through time? It's a good question. Hopefully both of those questions are relevant to you in your conversations that you have with your coworkers, with your friends, with people at school or uni, or somebody close to you. So with that, let me get my screen up. And can I ask somebody to tell me where where the camera is for the people that are live streaming, if I want to make a point and point at them? Up there? Oh, right here. Okay. So if I'm going to make a point about something, I'm going to look at you in the eye. Okay, so welcome to everyone on the ground floor, everyone on the balcony, and if you're live streaming as well. It's great that you've tuned in. So let's begin with a book that I read many, many years ago. Just by show of hands, raise your hand if you've even heard of this book. Okay, a couple? Nobody up in the balcony? No? Okay, this book was written, I think, in 2005 by Bart Ehrman. And let me just read what you would read if you read the back cover of this book. And with a title like that, how could you not pick that off the shelf? That is a really nice title, isn't it? Misquoting Jesus. The back of the book says this: for almost 1,500 years, the New Testament manuscripts were copied by hand, and mistakes and intentional changes abound in the competing manuscript versions. Religious and biblical scholar Bart Ehrman makes the provocative case that many of our widely held beliefs concerning the divinity of Jesus, the Trinity, and the divine origins of the Bible itself are the results of both intentional and accidental alterations by scribes. It goes on. In this compelling and fascinating book, Ehrman shows where and why changes were made in our earliest surviving manuscripts, explaining for the first time how that the many variations of our cherished biblical stories came to be, and why only certain versions of the stories qualify for publication in the Bibles we read today. Ehrman frames his account with personal reflections on how his study of the Greek manuscripts made him abandon his once ultra-conservative view of the Bible. Wow, that sounds like a great book, doesn't it? I'm going to tell you by the end of this talk why you don't have to worry about the back of that book. We're going to get all into the details here for a minute. But before we get there, I wonder if you have a good answer to something like that. Would you know what to say in response to something like that? Maybe you haven't heard it in such academic words, but a friend of mine back in the States told me recently, a guy that he works with, a coworker, said, oh, the people copying the Bible, they're just random guys way out in monasteries in the middle of nowhere. They didn't know what they were doing. They messed it up. They corrupted it. And how could you ever say otherwise? It's a really good question. So let's address the problem, because there are problems that we do need to talk about. And this is a safe place to talk about the problems. We're going to talk about how we do actually have issues we need to address when it comes to the reliability of the New Testament, but don't leave your seats. Don't run away screaming. I will tell you the answer to the problems, I promise, okay? So there are a couple of problems. The first one is that the original copies of the New Testament documents are lost to us. So whatever Matthew, the first gospel writer in our New Testament, wrote, his first published copy of that book, it's gone. It's gone. Same thing with Mark, same thing with Luke, same thing with John, same thing with the book of Acts and Romans and all Paul's letters. The original physical thing is gone. Now, that's not unique to the Bible. It's not unique to the New Testament. That's just how, that's how things happen in the ancient world. They get lost in fires and floods, and they just crumble. It just happens. But it is true. But the problem gets a little bit worse because the existing copies that we do have, and we do have existing copies that have been made after that fact, that stem back all the way to the original writings, they have differences between them. So if you pick up a manuscript that has been discovered by an archaeologist, it's in a museum, and you compare it to another copy that's been discovered in a different museum or a different place by an archaeologist, they will have differences between them. The wording will actually be different, and it's quite scary to think about that. So what that's called is a textual variant. I'm not going to teach you too many words tonight, but this is a term you should know, a textual variant. So what that means is that two manuscripts that have come down to us, copies of the Bible in its original language, they disagree in a place with wording. I'll give you an example of a textual variant. So here, this comes from the Sermon on the Mount, the greatest sermon ever preached. by Jesus, of course, in Matthew chapter 5 through 7. And he says, anyone who is angry with his brother will be subject to judgment, Matthew 5:22. Now, the words in red there, if you can see the screen, are a textual variant. So some manuscripts that we have that have come down to us, that have been discovered, that are copies, they go back to the original. Some have the words without cause, and some manuscripts do not have those two words. In fact, it's actually just one word in Greek, and it's a small word in Greek. But it's a small word that makes quite a big difference, doesn't it? I have two brothers, and I've been angry with both of those brothers many times. And there's one version of that verse that I want to be true, and there's another version that scares me because I've been angry with my brothers very often. What did Jesus actually say? That is a textual variant. Now, how many textual variants are there in the New Testament? When we get all of the manuscripts we can get together, all the copies of the New Testament, when we compare them all, how many differences do we find? Unfortunately, there's a lot. Not just this. There's quite a few. It's just a scholarly estimate because we can't actually count them all. There are so many. In fact, there's probably more, around about 400,000 different textual variants, places in the New Testament where the wording has some sort of variation. It's a big number, isn't it? It's kind of a scary number, but this is about the worst of it. We're going to go up from here, okay? I'll tell you why that number really shouldn't scare you and why the number, I'll tell you why that number is so high, in fact. But let's think logically for a minute. What could be one possible reason why that number is so high? One possible reason why that number is so high. Is it because the Bible is more prone to error in copying than other books? No, absolutely not. I don't know how you'd ever prove that. One reason why that number is so high is that we have so many copies of the New Testament. And boy, is this true. So we don't have the actual physical thing that Matthew and Mark and Luke and John wrote. Those are gone, the originals. But we've got a lot of copies. And when I say a lot, I mean we have a lot of copies, 5,500 plus. It's hard to count them for several reasons. One reason why we can't really count them is because they keep getting discovered. It seems like every year, every couple of years, more manuscripts surface. Ancient handmade copies in the original language, the Greek of the New Testament, are discovered almost routinely. Some are old, some are really old, some are super old. Some go back to the 4th century AD. Some go back to the 3rd century AD. Some go back beyond the 3rd century AD. Now, 5,000, I'm going to put that in context just in a moment, but we don't just have Greek manuscripts from many, many centuries ago. We also have ancient quotations by church fathers and ancient languages that the Bible has been translated into. So let's say the gospel is preached in Egypt in the 2nd century AD. They translate the Bible into their own language. All of a sudden, that language has a Bible of its own and creates another whole level of evidence that we can use to compare and say, what did the text look like in the 2nd century in Egypt? That's valuable information as a textual scholar to look and say, yes, it matches what we have in our Bible. It's great comfort, and it's another level of evidence above just the original Greek manuscripts. And then you have quotations of the church fathers above that. So all of the church fathers through all of history who have been arguing with one another about the Bible and quoting the Bible and preaching sermons about the Bible and writing books about the Bible, whenever they quote the text, we get a really good idea of another level of evidence to confirm what we know is true in our Bible. So the point I'm trying to make, even if you can't, wrap your mind around the numbers or anything like that, the point I'm trying to make is that New Testament scholars have an absolute wealth of information. And in comparison to other ancient books, we're doing real well. So what I'm showing you here is the number of surviving ancient manuscripts for the best attested books in history. The New Testament is over there far on the left side. You can see 5,500 plus manuscripts in its original language. The next best one after that is not Homer Simpson, but the ancient Greek poet Homer, who wrote the Iliad and the Odyssey. And the best attested book in history after the New Testament is Homer's Iliad, wildly popular in the ancient world, 1,700 surviving manuscripts in its original language. After that, Demosthenes, he has speeches. We've only got a few hundred of those. And it's the third best attested book in ancient history after the New Testament. I'm not playing with the numbers. I'm not cheating. I'm not showing you bad examples of books. I'm showing you the best books that the ancient world has to offer in terms of manuscript attestation. How many physical copies do we have to actually study and look at? The New Testament, we are doing real well. Okay, so let's say we've got a ton of manuscripts, and we do. We got lots and lots of actual evidence to sift and compare and look at and study. And I'll show you pictures of them in just a moment. You can look them all up. You can go on the internet and look at them, which is really, really interesting. Hopefully I'll remember to tell you later why that's interesting. But next, let's talk about the date of those manuscripts. Because what if you have a whole ton of manuscripts and they're all bad quality manuscripts? They have big holes in them, or they've been poorly copied, or they are all from thousands of years after the time of writing. Well, let's now consider another comparison to put this into context. How long after the time of writing do you get your first manuscript of the New Testament? Remember, we don't have the original thing, the physical thing, but we have copies of copies of copies. How long do you have to wait from after the time of writing? Let's say John wrote his gospel in, let's pick a number out of a hat, 75 AD or something like that. 80 AD, 85 AD, we know. How long after that date do we get to discover a manuscript of that book? How long do you have to wait? Well, for a lot, those are the exact same books I just showed you in the last slide, and most of them you have to wait hundreds of years. In the case of Caesar and his Gallic Wars, this is Julius Caesar going to Gaul, and he writes very movingly of his own exploits in Gaul, killing all the barbarians. You have to wait 950 years between the time of writing and the first manuscript of that book. That's a long time for errors to come into that text, for problems to happen. How long for the New Testament? It's really hard to say because we're working with decades. Decades. It's definitely less than 100 years between the writing of the books and the first manuscripts, but it's hard to be more precise than that. It could be as low as 50 years between the time of writing and our first attested manuscripts of the New Testament. I won't bore you with all the details of those. I can direct you to books that will give you all the numbers if you're into those little details. I'll press on. So less than 100 years. That is amazing in terms of historical evidence, that we have so much to study and we have lots of good evidence to study in terms of the transmission of the text. So let me put those two things together on one slide, okay? So the time of writing is over there on the far left. Time is elapsing as you move over. And there's 1,000 years roughly there. So what I'm going to do is plot for you the books that I just talked about, Homer's Iliad, Caesar's Gallic Wars, Demosthenes' speeches, and I'll show you where they sit on the timeline, how far away from the events they're describing, and how big they are corresponds to how many manuscripts we have. So the first one, that looks pretty good, right? So not many manuscripts, 400 manuscripts, 500 manuscripts. You know, you have to wait 200 years, you have to wait 400 years. Here's the New Testament. 5,500 in comparison to the others, and way over there next to the time of writing, because we're only waiting a few decades, maybe closer to 100 years, somewhere in there, before we get our first manuscript. So visually, you can see that the best books and the ancient world has to offer don't even compare with the quality of evidence we have for the transmission of the text through time. Let's just look at some pictures. I've given you a lot of facts and figures. Here are some of the oldest manuscripts of the New Testament. So I've been using that word over and over and over again. Those are some manuscripts there. Those are two different ones, and you can see that they're just really fragmentary. They're really just bits and pieces. But they still count because they are pieces of the New Testament. The one on the left is a bit of John's Gospel. It dates to sometime in the 2nd century, so sometime in the 100s AD. And then the one on the right is a bit of Matthew. Now, you can imagine way back 1,800 years ago, while the church was being persecuted, not a lot is going to survive. So it is miraculous that we have these at all. Well, let's look at some more. In the 3rd century, so we're talking about the 200s, manuscripts get bigger and nicer and better preserved. The one on the left is a page out of a whole stack of pages of Paul's letters, dates to 200 AD. And if you were willing to drive an hour and a half south, you could go see a lot of that manuscript. They're in Dublin. Oh, maybe further than an hour and a half, right? Maybe 2 hours? What would it take to get to Dublin? You can see most of that manuscript. It's there for free in a library because it still exists. And if you want to learn Greek, talking to you guys up at the top, now's the time to learn Greek. You can do it. And then you could read that manuscript, and you can read Paul's letters in its original words, its original language. That's something special. 1,800 years old. The one on the right is the Gospel of John, also dates to the 200s. Here's just a zoom in. That manuscript is of Revelation, also in Dublin. You can go see that as well. Or you can sit at your computer and look at high-res images instead. Here is what manuscripts begin to look like in the 4th century. What happens in the 4th century for Christians? They get money. You can tell they got some money here. That is a full Bible, Old Testament, New Testament, all in Greek, wonderfully preserved. That is in London. It dates to the mid-300s. So remember my friend and his coworker saying, oh, those guys copying the Bible, they didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know what they were doing. Who could write that well without lined paper? Not me. Even with lined paper, I go downhill and uphill. Look at that. Without reading glasses or electricity, when you have to make your own pen, ink, and paper. That is a work of art, is what that is. That's the beginning of John's Gospel. In the beginning was the Word. I could go on. There's so many of these. There is no shortage of manuscripts. We have so many. And remember those dates I was telling you? 4th century, 5th century, 3rd century, 2nd century. What am I establishing here? I'm establishing a timeline. We have a timeline of manuscripts that come to us from antiquity, and we can look at differences between the 6th century and the 5th, and the 5th and the 4th century, and the 4th and the 3rd, and the 3rd and the 2nd, all the way back. So if the text is going to be corrupted and transmitted by people that don't know what they're doing, we could track that. We can track that. But the amazing thing is, when we look at the manuscripts that we have, the New Testament text, and we compare them, what we see is remarkable stability over time. Stability. Now, what do I mean by that? And how can I say that when we've got 400,000 textual variants? Well, I'm going to talk for a minute now of the similarity of our manuscripts. So that is a scan of my Greek New Testament. I've got it right here. And at the bottom of the Greek New Testament, if you look at the bottom half of the page, you'll see all of the variants you would ever want to see. The bottom half of that page shows you all of the textual variant, where all the manuscripts disagree, where they have differences in wording. They're not hidden away in a vault somewhere. They are out in the open for anyone to see. All you have to do is learn Greek, and then you can do it. Christianity is an open book, literally. We have nothing to hide. if there was a textual variant that would undo the Christian church, it has not yet been discovered. I was teaching a friend of mine a few years ago. He wanted to learn how to read the bottom half of the page there. And so I met with him once a week, and we read the Gospel of Matthew. And I wanted to convince him that studying manuscripts was interesting, because obviously I thought it was interesting, and I wanted to teach him that it was. So I was showing him how to do this sort of studying of the differences between manuscripts, and it was really frustrating. It was actually really, really frustrating. You know why? Because we read half of Matthew together, week by week. We read half of Matthew and looked at every single textual variant that exists in the New Testament. And there wasn't a single interesting one. It never got exciting. It never got to a point where it was like, oh, wow, this could change everything. There was nothing like that. I was really hoping I could find like a nice, juicy variant for him, to really get him. But it was really, really boring. And that's important, isn't it? That's very, very interesting. That we looked at every single difference consistently, all the manuscripts, as much as we could, and we couldn't find anything that was going to rock the boat, so to speak. The vast majority of the differences, remember the 400,000 number? The vast majority of those are untranslatable, meaning they don't affect the meaning of the text whatsoever. They don't affect the meaning of the text. I'm giving you a couple examples of what constitutes those 400,000 variants. Spelling John with 2 N's rather than 1. Every time a scribe came across John and wrote 2 N's instead of 1, and it happened a lot. Every time, that counts as a textual variant. And if he does it again in the next verse, that counts too. You see how they start to add up. Whenever you put the word the where it doesn't belong, which happens in Greek all the time, not so much in English, but it does happen in Greek all the time, that counts as a textual variant. And the next time you make the mistake in the next line, that counts too. Now, those don't make any difference in terms of meaning, and we can't even bring those into English or translate them, yet they count towards that 400,000. Now, many of our variants in the manuscripts are not viable. What do I mean by that? They're not viable. They are clear differences between manuscripts, but no one in their right mind thinks that that difference has any claim to originality. So there's a famous verse in the book of Revelation where it says that the former things have passed away. Wonderful verse. There's a manuscript. You've actually seen a copy or a picture of this manuscript. One manuscript says that the sheep have passed away. Why? Because the word is very, very similar. Those two words are very, very similar. It's an obvious mistake. It's an obvious error. Yet that counts as a textual variant. But it's not viable. No one thinks for a moment that that's what John wrote in Revelation. So only a very tiny minority of that big number are actually meaningful and viable. But the bottom line, and what we all need to recognize, is that no essential doctrine of the Christian faith hangs in the balance because of a textual variant. So what do I mean by that? When we're talking about the core essential doctrines of Christianity, Christ's full divinity, his full humanity, his bodily resurrection, the virgin birth, salvation by grace through faith. Not a single one of those, or many, many others, are in any way endangered by a textual variant. Not in the least. However, don't take my word for it. Take Bart Ehrman's word for it. So let me read again from Bart Ehrman, but we're going to read now from the footnotes of an appendix in a second edition of that book, okay? So remember, he was the author of Misquoting Jesus. Well, here he's talking about his mentor, Bruce Metzger. Bruce Metzger was a believer and who taught Bart Ehrman the New Testament. And he speaks about Bruce Metzger here. He says, Bruce Metzger is one of the great scholars of modern times, and I dedicated the book to him because he was both my inspiration for going into text criticism and the person who trained me in the field. I have nothing but respect and admiration for him. And even though we may disagree on important religious questions, we are in complete agreement on a number of very important historical and textual questions. If he and I were put in a room and asked to hammer out a consensus statement on what we think the original text of the New Testament probably looked like, there would be very few points of disagreement. Maybe 1 or 2 dozen places out of many thousands. The position I argue for in misquoting Jesus does not actually stand at odds with Professor Metzger's position that the essential Christian beliefs are not affected by textual variants in the manuscript tradition of the New Testament. It's hard to believe that the same person who wrote the back of the book wrote that as well, but he did. Because the bottom line is that there are no textual variants that cast into doubt the core beliefs of Christianity. I can say more about that in the Q&A if you want. I'm sure I'm passing over things that you're interested in. Please do jot down notes and we'll come back and answer those. But let's wrap up this first session. So this comes from a book that was recently published, which got lots of good information about the numbers of manuscripts we have in each century. Really helpful to see how we can track the continuity of the text over time. We're not stuck with Bibles from the 21st century. We tend to think that the Bible is translated and then we lose what was translated. And then it's translated and we lost that. And it's translated and we lost that. And that is the wrong way to think about textual transmission. That's not how it happens. If I can go online right now and look up manuscripts from the 5th century and the 4th century, it'd be much better to think of it like this. It spreads out, it grows, it's copied and copied and copied. And yes, we do lose bits here and there, but we're not stuck with what was just copied. We haven't lost what was copied in the previous generation. We actually still have it. We can look at it. It's freely available to look at for anyone who's interested. We have nothing to hide. So, to conclude, I'm not exaggerating when I say, and even critical, skeptical scholars will agree, that the New Testament is by far the best attested book from ancient history in terms of manuscript evidence, the amount of them, and the quality of them. There's more material evidence for the New Testament than any other ancient book. So the remaining problems that we have are worth talking about. They're worth considering and looking at in the face. But they are relatively minor when we put into perspective that even the skeptics, even the critics are willing to say the essential doctrines of Christianity, they're not in doubt. They're not in doubt. Okay, I've gone on long enough for our first session, so let's take our 5-minute break. Tim, if you want me to do anything else, we can just say, take a little comfort break, and we'll pick it back up in 5 minutes. Thank you. Okay, fun's over. Back to your seat, back to your bubble, and we'll get going here again. Now, let's pick it up. We're going to shift gears now, and we're going to stop talking about the reliability of the textual transmission. And if you've got questions, please do ask them at the end. Now we're going to talk about the actual accounts themselves, specifically in the New Testament. Why would I ever want to believe, someone might ask, something written by pre-modern, people that believed in miracles? It's a good question. Now, unfortunately, for this question, I don't have as many facts and figures. It's hard to mathematically prove that an account like the Bible, like the New Testament, like the Gospels, is true. It's a lot harder to do that. So I'm going to do it in a different way, and I'm just going to tell you kind of personally how I have come to a place where I trust the New Testament, and I trust the Gospels. And I think we have really good reasons to trust the Gospels. It's not going to be as mathematically logical and things like that, but hopefully it will be personal and understandable to you. And so I grew up in a Christian home, and my dad is a pastor, still is. But I've had to, come to my own understanding of my faith. And it's involved the academic study of the Bible, the critical study of the Bible in different contexts in America and here in the UK. And why am I still a Christian? And why do I still trust the Bible? Let's talk about 3 steps that I've taken in my approach to the text of the New Testament and the account that it gives. 3 quick steps. And they're just going to be getting closer and closer in specificity to the New Testament. First is the big picture of the Bible. First step I took in asking why should I trust the Bible and the story it tells has to do with the big picture. What do I mean by the big picture of the Bible? So, does the Bible take place in a place like Hades or Valhalla or some fairy tale world that we can never go to or see? Or does the Bible actually take place, for the most part, in this world? Talk to someone on the street and they may have no idea. I hope you have an idea. You just don't even realize it yet. But the Bible, amazingly, takes place in this world. It takes place in locations that you can go and see if you have the money to go and see. It takes place by lakes and mountains and in towns that still exist. It takes place in accounts with people and individuals whom we know from other historical sources. Household names like Nebuchadnezzar, right? Darius, Xerxes, Herod, Caesar Augustus, Tiberius Caesar, all the familiar names that you name your children. They were real people, and we know of them from historical sources outside the Bible. And it is 100% true that when the Bible is talking about them, they're talking about those historical individuals. The Bible, what I'm saying, is woven into this world in a way that other mythologies, other religions, other ancient books are not. They talk about stories that cannot be verified. They talk about people who lived in primeval times way before there was history. They took place in Hades or in paradise somewhere, and they could never be verified. And the Bible opens itself up to historical and archaeological scrutiny. Isn't that amazing? The Bible takes a big risk in saying, not that Jesus died for my sins, but that Jesus died for my sins around about 30 to 33 AD under the reign of Tiberius Caesar, under the governorship of Pontius Pilate, on a specific hill, in a particular town, in a country, in a province, in a Roman Empire. And there are named witnesses. And there's a timeline down to the hour of when he died and when he was buried and when he rose again. We're talking about two completely different things. When we want to talk about mythology and other religions, they do not have what the Bible has. The Bible is woven in to this world. Let me just give you a few examples. I could go on and on and on forever. I'll just give you three. So this is someone you may have never heard of. He's a fellow named Gallio. Gallio is mentioned once in the Bible in the book of Acts, chapter 18. The Apostle Paul is on his second journey. He's in Achaia. He's in Greece. And he's brought before Gallio. Gallio is the proconsul of Achaia. Why do you care? Why does Luke care when he writes the book of Acts? This sounds like a throwaway line. Paul is brought before Gallio, and Gallio doesn't really care to judge Paul's case. He sends him back to the Jews. You handle this, I don't care. And then Luke moves on in the story. Why do you care? Why should you care? Because Gallio is a real person. And his name is inscribed in this plaque. This is inscribed by the Emperor Tiberius to his friend, the proconsul Gallio. Exactly where it should be. Exactly in the place where Paul was. That's what we're talking about, a real person, a real proconsul, who everyone thought was a lie, a made-up character, until about 100 years ago this plaque was discovered. Not only does it ground Paul's journey in reality, in a place before a person, it grounds it precisely in a time, because we know Gallio's career now from other sources. We can put Paul in Corinth in 52 AD with historical certainty. That's why a random guy named Gallio should be important to you. Here's another one. This one was discovered even more recently than that. So the Gospel of John is very often disparaged by critical scholars as being fanciful, symbolic, theological, but not real. I wonder if you have an answer for that. But, lo and behold, John talks about things, specifically the geography of Jerusalem, in ways that continue to astound us. He talks about specific sites and specific things with names that blow us away, because archaeologists did not discover this. Plumbers discovered this. This is discovered by plumbers digging in the old city of Jerusalem 15 years ago. 2004, they were digging plumbing lines through Jerusalem, and they ran across what looked like an ancient pool. And indeed, it was an ancient pool. They finally got some archaeologists to look at it. It was a pool. And it happens to be right by where the Gospel of John says the pool of Siloam was, John chapter 9, which up until 2014 sounded really fishy. It sounded real suspicious. Why? Because Siloam, John tells us, means sent. So it sounds kind of like a symbolic thing that John is just making up. We'll dismiss it as a religious symbol or something until it's discovered. Archaeologists were able to pinpoint the date of that pool because the workmen who made the pool 2,000 years ago, actually a little bit more than 2,000 years ago, happened to press coins into the plaster of the pool. And those coins were from precisely the date that makes this a very, very, very tempting site of the Pool of Siloam. And so the archaeologist, Charles, you can follow that link. You can look this up. Just Google it, and you'll find it. On and on and on. Sites like this are found, discovered, studied, and they demonstrate that the Bible does not take place in some fairy tale world. It takes place in a world you can touch and smell. One more example. This one, I like this one. Yeah, I hope you'll like this one too. Hopefully it won't confuse you. So, what are those? That's a Roman denarius. A Roman denarius. Why should you care what a denarius is or what it looks like? Well, there's a great story in the Gospel of Mark. It's in the other Gospels as well, but Mark chapter 12, Jesus is approached by opponents, and they say, should we give the tax to Caesar? And they show him a denarius. Now, what the Gospel writers know is what a denarius is. And they know precisely in what denomination taxes were paid to Caesar. Who cares? Big deal. Well, all it takes is a couple of generations, and people don't know that anymore. There's another text. This is outside of the New Testament. It's a text written in the 2nd century. It's called the Gospel of Thomas. Gospel of Thomas. Not written by the disciple Thomas. No connection to the disciple Thomas. But it's non-canonical, meaning it's not authoritative. It's written much, much later, 2nd century in the 100s. Has a similar story about opponents coming to Jesus and saying, shall we pay the tax to Caesar? But they get it wrong. And they don't show him a silver denarius. They show him a gold coin. Whoever wrote the Gospel of Thomas didn't know what you paid the tax with. Very, very minor detail, but it shows who knows what's going on in the time and place and who does not. If you're going to trust a text to tell you something true about Jesus, what do you want? The one that knows in what particular denomination taxes are paid to Caesar? Or the one that has forgotten and just says a gold coin? As I said, we could go on and on with example and example of specific ways in which the Bible is enmeshed with history and archaeology. Where we can test the New Testament, where we have outside sources and can bring them to bear on the New Testament. The New Testament again and again and again impresses us, not just with detail, but accuracy of information. I could bore you for ages with more and more specifics, but ask me for books and I'll give you recommendations. We'll move on now. So that's the first step. The first step is just to see the big picture. The big picture is that the Bible exists in this world in ways that we can test it and we can verify it and we can see it. Second step, how does the Bible present itself? Wouldn't it be a really big mistake to believe the Bible and found a religion upon it if it never meant to be taken seriously? That would be a big mistake, wouldn't it? Second step is to zoom in a little bit and to say, how does the Bible present itself? This is a guy who wrote histories well before the time of the New Testament, 400 years before the New Testament. He's called the father of history, Herodotus. I love what he says, what Herodotus says. It is said that there is a lake on this island from which the maidens of the country draw gold dust out of the mud on feathers smeared with pitch. I do not know whether this is true. I just write what is said. But all things are possible. Don't you love that? He's writing history. And he says, I've got really no idea whether this is true or not. But all things are possible. What does the New Testament say? In fact, what is the consistent message of all the New Testament writers? They say stuff like this. This is Paul writing in 1 Corinthians. What I received, I passed on to you as of first importance, that Christ died for our sins according to the Scriptures, that he was buried, that he was raised on the third day according to the Scriptures, and that he appeared to Cephas, and then to the 12. And after that, he appeared to more than 500 of the brothers and sisters at the same time, most of whom are still living, though some have fallen asleep. Then he appeared to James, then to all the apostles, and last of all, he appeared to me as one abnormally or untimely born. The consistent message of the New Testament is not, I heard it this way. This is how we tell stories, right? Tomorrow morning, you're going to even tell a story like this at work or at school or something. I heard that she said, that he said. That's how our stories go. That's not how the accounts go in the New Testament. They say, Jesus died, he was raised again, and there are hundreds of witnesses, and you can go see them. They're listed by name. Similarly, another text, Gospel of Luke, begins this way. Many have undertaken to draw up an account of the things that have been fulfilled among us, just as they were handed down to us by those who from the first were eyewitnesses and servants of the word. With this in mind, since I myself have carefully investigated everything from the beginning, I too decided to write an orderly account for you, most excellent Theophilus, so that you may know the certainty of the things you have been taught. The book does not begin, hey, I don't know if any of this is true, but Jesus taught a bunch of good things, and you should really, listen to him. I don't know if he did the miracles that are ascribed to him, but he's a good teacher. You should trust him. He does not say that. Neither does Paul say that. There's no waffling here. There's no hands up, distancing himself from the material. He's saying, I have carefully investigated, and I'm writing to give you certainty so that you may know. So we need to take seriously how the Bible presents itself. That's an important step, because we don't want to make the mistake of interpreting the Bible in a way it never meant to be interpreted or understood. So that's the first two steps in my mind that I've taken. Big picture. Is the Bible at all plausible? A resounding yes. How is the Bible meant to be interpreted and understood? It sees itself as reliable eyewitness testimony. Not hearsay, reliable testimony with named individuals that you can go talk to. Well, you can't anymore, but in the time of writing, you could have. What's the third step? Now let's zoom in even further and look at some potential problems, even the details of what about the contradictions between the Gospels? What about those sorts of problems? A great one to start with is the resurrection of Jesus. Jesus is raised on Easter morning, on Sunday morning, and he is visited by the women. How many women went to the tomb? Well, here's one place where scholars say, aha, the Bible can't get its story straight. How many women went to the tomb? The Gospel of Mark says that Mary and another Mary and probably another Mary and then someone named Salome went to the tomb. But the Gospel of John just says one Mary, just one woman went to the tomb. Aha, there's a contradiction, right? Well, I'm not so sure that's a contradiction. Why? Because of steps 1 and 2. Because of steps 1 and 2, they put me in a much better position to consider potential problems like this. Let's actually look at the detail of what John says. John tells us at the beginning of John chapter 20 that Mary Magdalene goes to the tomb and she finds no body there. And then she runs and tells the disciples, they have taken the Lord out of the tomb, and we don't know where they have put him. Who is we? Who's we? She's the only woman that John has told us has gone to the tomb. Obviously, John is not saying that only Mary went to the tomb. He is focusing on one person because that is his narrative intent. We have to give him the freedom to tell the account how he wants to tell the account. If we want to read into that that's a contradiction, then the word contradiction no longer has any meaning in my mind. Having steps 1 and 2, we're in a much better position to say these gospel writers have the freedom to tell the accounts in the way that they want and still be true, even if they're not telling you every detail. It goes on. How many angels were in the tomb? How many angels greeted the women at the tomb? Gospel of Mark says just one. He calls him a young man, in fact. Gospel of Matthew says there's 2. Aha, contradiction. Well, what if Mark has a very good reason, a very good narrative reason, a literary reason for focusing on one rather than telling you about two. If we're going to call that a contradiction, the word contradiction no longer has any meaning to me. We are focusing on such minute details that we have missed the forest. Because all the gospel writers agree not only that there was a Jesus, that he died on Friday in a particular way by crucifixion at a particular time. They all agree on that. They all agree that he was buried in a tomb. They all agree that he was raised on Sunday, Easter morning. They agree when he was raised and how he was raised and the manner he was raised. They all agree. And we're going to look at the detail of how many angels does Mark say were there compared to how many Matthew says were there, and call that a contradiction. We have lost the plot when we do that. What we need to do is appreciate how much the gospel writers have in common and how much Paul and Peter and John, the other writers, have in common with the gospel writers. I love this quotation from scholar N.T. Wright. I realize I could be alienating myself by putting his name up here, but it's a great quote. Just bear with me. The stories of the resurrection, the stories exhibit, as has been said repeatedly over the last 100 years or more, exactly that surface tension which we associate not with tales artfully told by people eager to sustain a fiction and therefore anxious to make everything look right, but with the hurried, puzzled accounts of those who have seen with their own eyes something which took them horribly by surprise and with which they have not yet fully come to terms. I love this because it helps remind us that the actual differences in the way the stories are told helps confirm that the gospel writers have not colluded with one another. And they didn't get together and make sure the story was unanimously perfect. They actually approached the narratives in their own way. And while there are surface tensions like how many women, how many angels, the substance of the accounts are absolutely the same, absolutely reliable, down to the hour, down to the names, down to the places. And yet, with all of that, we still cannot come up with a better explanation for the accounts other than Jesus really, really was raised from the dead. Think about that for a minute. There's not been any better explanation after 2,000 years for what actually happened Easter morning. The best explanation, the one that raises no other questions with the evidence that we have, is that Jesus really did raise from the dead. Why couldn't they just find his body? Why couldn't they just find Jesus' body and put an end to all the speculation? Why didn't the Roman authorities just bring out his body? End it all. Kill the Christian movement right where it started. Why didn't the Jewish authorities do it? It would have been so easy. The easiest way to kill Christianity, to show the body of Jesus, and no one could do it. That should fill you with awe and wonder. That should fill you with excitement that it's been 2,000 years and no one has come up with a better explanation for the events of Easter morning than what we have in the New Testament Gospels. That is absolutely wonderful. So let me close simply by saying that the reason why I trust the Scriptures, and I've come to understand them to be trustworthy, is because they've been passed down by reliable eyewitnesses who have grounded that message in historically accurate information. They present themselves as trustworthy, and there's been no better explanation for what happened on Easter morning. I still have yet to hear one. I don't know if that's helpful for you and your understanding of how to trust the Bible or why we can trust the Bible, but it's a little bit of my own journey. It's a little bit of my own story. And so I hope it's somewhat helpful to you, but if you've got questions, should we go right in, Tim, right now would be a good time to go right into the Q&A? I'll let you come up. But I'll end it there and invite Tim then to come up, and we'll start the Q&A.
Well, thank you very much, Zach. That was very clear, very engaging, and I hope very helpful. And I'm sure we would have loved to have heard much more, and there's much more that could be said. And perhaps at the end, we'll ask you about some resources that if people are interested, they can go and have a look themselves. We are going to put up again, in case there are any last-minute questions, the phone number and the email address. So the phone number has been popular, the email address less so. So unpopular, zero questions on the email. So if there are any other questions, please send them through. I'm going to try and group them. We might not be able to get through all of them, but I'll try to group them into the same kinds of questions. Okay, so the first question, or the first group of questions, Zach, is about the methods behind dating manuscripts. So what are the techniques that people use to date manuscripts, and how can we be confident that whenever an authority says this manuscript was from this time, that they have good reason, good confidence for that date that they're using?
Great question. So how do you date a manuscript? It's a funny way to put it, but it's not an exact science, but it's a pretty good science. And so what they do is what's called paleography, and you compare the handwriting to other texts that are discovered. So you've got texts of Homer, texts of Herodotus, texts of whatever. They've all been written in these different handwritings, and if you find a manuscript and you say, where's this from? You can kind of date it by looking and comparing the handwriting. That's called paleography. You can also do it by radiocarbon dating things. You can do it with microscopes and chemicals and things like that. And usually people think that is, the end all, there's a microscope, so it must be true. And actually it's more complicated than that. But when you get two of those together, when you can radiocarbon date something and you can look at the paleography, that's perfect for a scholar. Like, love that. So you've heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls? Dead Sea Scrolls, they were carbon dated in a microscope, in a laboratory, and they were dated paleographically, and they agreed. Amazing. Paleographic changing of the text, they compared that with the radiocarbon analysis, and they agreed they were authentically ancient, authentically old. Now, I didn't talk about the Dead Sea Scrolls because there were no New Testament manuscripts in the Dead Sea Scrolls, just Old Testament, but that's another story. So that's the answer to that question.
And you've actually answered another question already there. One somebody has asked about the Dead Sea Scrolls, why were they so important, and did they contain New Testament and Old Testament?
Right.
So Old Testament, but why were they important?
So why are they important? Well, they're important. They're, without a doubt, the most important biblical discovery of the last century, probably even more than that. They are important because they demonstrate the care of copying over the centuries, specifically of the Old Testament. So they were discovered in the 1940s in the desert of the Middle East, over by the Dead Sea, and they were reliably dated to before the time of Jesus. 3rd century BC, 2nd century BC, some of them, and copious amounts of text, tons of text, complete copy of Isaiah, on and on and on. And it demonstrated very careful copying over time. Wonderful, wonderful demonstration of the reliability of the Old Testament. And I didn't talk about them because they are Old Testament manuscripts, not new. And that's kind of obvious since they were copied in the 3rd and 2nd century BC. That's before the time of the New Testament. So that's why there's none in there. Yeah.
We've had a few questions about the end of Mark's Gospel. There's a group of verses there that most of the Bibles say many of the ancient manuscripts don't have or include these verses. What are those verses? Why are they there? Should we regard them as scripture? Should we think about them, read about them? What's your take on that section at the end of Mark?
Yeah, so I said earlier that when it comes to the actual problems that we have with the New Testament text, they're very minor in the sense that they don't endanger any big doctrines. there are two big variants. That means like variants between our manuscripts that are bigger than a verse. One of them is the ending of Mark, specifically chapter 16, verses 9 through 20. So the angel says to the women, he's not here, he's risen, go tell his disciples. And a couple of manuscripts, really old manuscripts of Mark, end right there. The women were afraid and they said nothing, end of story. And a couple really old manuscripts end right there. Most of our manuscripts, though, most of the, a couple thousand manuscripts do have those verses in there, 9 through 20, which shows Jesus appearing to different people. So that is one of the more famous variants. Now, what do you do with it? There are good Christian scholars on both sides of this issue. What I mean by that, there are good Christian scholars that say those verses 9 through 20 are authentic and original to Mark, and it looks like there's been some error in the early copying that led to their deletion. There are also really good Christian scholars on the other side saying those verses look like an addition that weren't necessarily part of the original copy of Mark. You don't really need to make a decision on that, and you don't really need to worry about it, because as I said, we don't lose any doctrine if we lose those verses. Jesus is still raised. Even if it stops at verse 8, he's still raised in the other Gospels. We don't lose any doctrine. Nothing's gone. But the question remains, do we study them? Do we preach them? Do we teach them? And as I say, good Christians on both sides. So you have a long history of preaching and teaching it on your side if you want to keep it. But the best thing to do is to try and do as much research as you can and go with your conscience. Go with your conscience. Go with the way the Holy Spirit is leading you. Because when you're in doubt about something and there's good Christians on both sides, that's okay. That's okay. You can, rest easy that there are good, intelligent people on both sides of that. So go with your conscience. You know what I mean? I don't know if that answers the question, but that would be my advice. Yeah.
Thank you, Zach. I think we'll do two more questions. One will lead to the next. So this question is about other religions and their ancient manuscripts. So perhaps we'll look at Islam, Hinduism, and so on. You've mentioned other ancient manuscripts of writings of Caesar and so on. How does Christianity compare with other religions in terms of reliability of their manuscripts? If you can comment on that, Eric.
Sure, great question. The trick with Islam and the Quran is that we don't know how many manuscripts they have because they won't tell us. It's a guarded secret. There is, I showed you the bottom half of my New Testament. It's out there in the open for anyone that wants to look. You cannot do that in Islam. You cannot look at the manuscripts and compare them of the Quran. It's a kept secret. And if you do study it academically, you have to do it under a pseudonym because you're taking your life in your own hands. Now, if that fills you with confidence about the Quran, then I don't know what to tell you. But if it fills you with confidence about the Bible, then right on, because that's true, it's right. Now, with other religious texts, it's very similar. So, for example, the Book of Mormon. The story of the writing of the Book of Mormon is that it comes through one guy. One guy. Dictated through one guy. He had the tablets, and he had the glasses, and he could read it all. One person. What's the Bible? Dozens of different people, different languages, different times, different places, all writing from different perspectives, and they're all singing with one voice the narrative of God's redemption through history. I'll take that over one guy any day. So that's my perspective of the way that other religious texts work. The Bible outstrips them by far in every category in terms of manuscript attestation and the actual thing itself. It's woven into history, and it's so fully orbed about God's redemption from day one in history unto Revelation. There's just nothing better. There's absolutely nothing better than the Bible.
The question we'll finish with, and I do apologize if I haven't been able to ask your question. If you've presented a pretty conclusive case, some might say, so if the evidence is so conclusive and there are no better solutions to the missing body of Jesus, then why doesn't everyone believe? Is there a logical reason not to believe, or is it just a social, emotional objection, or some other reason? So why doesn't everyone believe that you've presented such a convincing argument?
It's a good question, and now we're leaving my area of knowledge and we're moving into the realm of my ignorance. But I can tell from experience that a lot of people don't believe because they don't care. So what if Jesus really did rise from the dead? What does that have to do with me? What does that have to do with my weekend? What does it have to do with tonight when I can go home? And my next meal, or my next relationship, or my next thing? It's just apathy. It's who cares? And that's a really big thing that's becoming greater and more prevalent as I talk to university students, as I talk to even my own friends and people in my generation, which is well beyond university age now. It's just apathy. It's, I don't care. And part of the problem is, you might have a really good case for the historical Jesus and the truth of the gospel, but we've lost a lot of the theological furniture in our mind. And what I mean by that is, our generation, they've got no concept of judgment, hell. And when you don't have that hanging over you and bothering you in your sleep, you don't need to be saved from anything. You're not worried about it. You're not concerned about it. And so it's less of an issue. So I think it's that loss of biblical literacy, that loss of Christian worldview that's eroding, gives way to just an apathy and just not really caring. That's what I would say. But again, I'm speculating and going into the realm of my lack of knowledge there. Yeah.
Zach, thank you so much for coming to speak to us tonight. You may wish to show your appreciation to Zach for coming from Florida. So, is Christianity fictional? That was this evening with Zach Cole. In 2 weeks' time, we are back here again to ask the question, is Christianity harmful? And Paul Coulter will be coming to join us for that. Paul is a qualified doctor and a theologian. He's going to be looking at questions and objections relating to is Christianity harmful for mental health, what it says about gender, sexuality, and all these other important things. So that will be a really great evening, so do try to get along. There'll be a Q&A at the end of that as well. So thank you so much and hope to see you again. Good night.